Are you seeing my slide now?
Yes. So this works great.
Okay.
Seems Martha has joined us, so we're waiting just for Sun. I just
everyone. I just managed to find the right link, so I'm here.
Hi, Martha. Great.
Martha Bailey. Yeah, I attended the attendee link, but I'm a participant in this. I got it.
Perfect.
Terrific. So I think everybody's gotten the hang of everything, and we are ready to go with our first talk. I see. So
we're just sorry, Martha, we're just waiting for Sun to join in. Do you know?
I don't have any more information. I'm sure he'll be here shortly.
Okay.
He's the second one, right?
Sorry?
On the schedule, he's the second one.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so we can start without him. Hopefully he'll join.
Yeah, I suggest we start without him so we keep everything on time and he can join. Hopefully he's just a few minutes late. And if not, we can try to figure out what's going on in the background. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and start the first talk, and I'll keep time here. It'll be 15 minutes for presentation, and then we'll move on to the Q&A for the last 5 minutes.
Okay. Can I start?
Oh, please.
Okay, thank you. So I am Christelle from University of Ottawa. So today the paper that I'm presenting is a joint work with Professor David Koenig from Harvard and Professor Roland Pongu from University of Ottawa. So in this paper, we are examining how colonial institutions and exogenous economic forces interact to affect fertility behavior. This study is motivated by a concern raised by policymakers who argue that the research agenda analyzing the long-term economic impact of history is of little relevance for policy making because history itself cannot be changed. So even though we acknowledge the fact that history cannot be changed, we ask a different question in this paper. We ask the question of whether appropriately designed economic incentives or economic policies can mitigate or modify the long-term impact of historical institutions. So we address this broad question in this paper by focusing on the effect of colonial institutions on reproductive behavior. An ideal setting for this study is Sub-Saharan Africa, and this is for several good reasons. Sub-Saharan Africa is the region of the world that has the highest fertility rate. And some scholars believe that Africa has remained the poorest region of the world because of this high fertility level. To illustrate this statement, the World Bank estimates that an average woman has 4.8 children in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is twice as high as the world average of 2.4 children per woman, which is huge. But in addition to that, fertility rates vary significantly across African countries, with some countries at the very early stage of the demographic transition, while others are more advanced in the transition. And in the economic growth literature, this variation has been explained by differences in geographical factors, cultural characteristics, historical shocks. But so far, little is known about how historical political institutions affect reproductive behavior. More importantly, the literature remains very quiet about whether the effects of these historical institutions can be modified by certain policy interventions. So our goal in this paper is to fill this important gap in the literature, and to achieve this goal, we specifically do three things. So first, we study the long-term impact of British versus French colonization on reproductive behavior. And the focus on British and French colonization here is because those are the two major colonizers in Africa. And they brought with them very different institutions relevant for economic development and reproductive behavior. I will try to describe those differences in the next slides. But the outcome that we focus on this paper are fertility, sexual behavior, and marriage patterns. The second exercise that we do in the paper is to analyze the heterogeneity in the long-term impact of colonial institutions on fertility. And here, I believe this is the central part of the paper. The rationale for this study is that market access increases female labor participation, and this raises the opportunity cost of childbearing. So we will argue that if the effect of market access on fertility dominates the fertility effect of colonial institutions, then we should expect the fertility effect of historical institutions to be low in areas with high market access and to be high in areas with low market access. And this is the central hypothesis that we are testing in the paper. And as I already mentioned, this heterogeneous analysis will help us address the concern raised by policymakers about the relevance of the agenda that document the long-term impact of historical shocks. But it will also allow us to uncover for the first time the heterogeneous nature of the colonial origins of fertility behavior and comparative economic development in Africa. So finally, we also explore the mechanisms through which the fertility effect of British colonization operates. And we document a direct mechanism that is driven by colonial population policies and an indirect mechanism driven by differences in colonial governance rules and how they affect the proximate determinant of fertility, including female education and child quality. So I will briefly talk about why we believe colonial origins matter, and which is based on the two mechanisms that I just raised. So we document both a direct mechanism based on the differences in colonial population policies. So the colonial population policies differ drastically between former British and French colonies. Why on the French side, France adopted after the First World War a law that prohibited any propaganda on contraceptive use, and they extended this law in their colonies. This law is still applied in most former French colonies in Africa, even though it has been repealed in France. And it is likely that these laws have raised important barriers to contraceptive use that persisted to the present day. This might explain why most of the governance in former French colonies remain reluctant in national family planning policies. But this is in sharp contrast to what we observe in former British colonies in Africa, where family planning policies and clinics promoting contraceptive use appear a few years before the independence. In fact, these countries were influenced by the more liberal culture of reproductive rights that emerged in England and was exported to their colonies. So we also have this indirect role of colonial institutions that could matter to explain the effect. So the literature has documented differences in several characteristics, including differences, the indirect versus the direct rule, differences in the legal system, the marital laws. And it has been shown that these differences may have ambiguous effect on fertility behavior. But for the sake of the time, I will not spend too much time here, but I will continue directly to our empirical strategy to show how we try to identify the impact of the causal impact of a colonial institution on reproductive behavior. So in this paper, we use individual level data coming from the demographic and health surveys that we combine with historical data on ethnicities in Africa. So the idea of our identification strategy would be to exploit this randomization that occurred during the Scramble for Africa. So the Scramble for Africa is just these historical events where Europeans divided Africa without any or with very limited knowledge of the current situation in Africa. And because of that, this has led to a partition of historical ethnic homeland into different former colonies. So what we'll use this randomization in order to identify, to examine the impact of colonial institution on fertility behavior. So our identification strategy is best summarized by these two maps, where we overlay the boundaries, the former boundaries of ethnic homelands in Africa with current boundaries in Africa. And this allows us to identify those ethnic groups that were split between former British and French areas. And we exploit variation within historical ethnic homeland partition across these former British and French colonies to identify our effect. So basically, this is a special regression discontinuity design that we are using in this paper. So this strategy allows us to account for ethnic specific characteristics that will explain the outcome. So we show that some relevant geographical and historical determinants of the outcome of interest are do not differ across the British and French areas. And we also consider seriously the possibility that there's migration which might generate some spillover effect at the border. And we control for that in the paper in many ways, including just focusing on people who never migrated. So our estimation strategy is mathematically summarized by this equation, where we just regress our outcome of interest on whether or not the individual fall in the British or French area, and we include ethnic homelands fixed effect, but also we control for a second order RG polynomial of distance from the to the British-French border. So this is a strategy that, this is a specification that has been used many times in the literature. So in terms of the result, this is an illustration of our regression discontinuity design, the result. So here we plot on this graph on the x-axis, we have distance to the British-French border, and with positive value falling on the British side and negative value falling on the French side. And as you can see here, there is a clear jump at the border showing that from women living in the Anglophone side of, in Anglophone area have significantly fewer children compared to women in Francophone areas. And this result is also confirmed when we look at the estimate. So in this table, we provide estimate of the effect using different specification. So we use different bandwidth, and also we control for migration or for spillover at the border. And as you can see from this graph here, from this table, sorry, the effect of British colonization is negative and highly significant, with Anglophone women having on average 0.3 fewer children compared to their counterpart in former French colonies. And we find also a similar result when we use other outcomes, including age at first birth and the timing of sexual intercourse as well, and the timing of marriage. But for the sake of the time, I will not show this result here. So let's talk about the central part of the study, which is the heterogeneity by market access. So we want to examine whether exogenous economic incentive can mitigate the effect of historical shocks. Here we measure market access by proximity to sea, and this is for good reason. So using different proxy for local economic development, we find that areas close to the sea are more developed and thus has higher opportunity cost of childbearing compared to the hinterland. And we show that the closer we are to the coast, the higher the level of economic development as measured by different outcome, including light density or the including light density, and higher the opportunity cost of childbearing as measured by the likelihood of being a high-skilled worker or the likelihood of working for cash or by asset ownership. And we also show that this result hold in both British and French colonies. That is, area closer to the sea are more developed irrespective of colonial origins. So we therefore argue based on this that if the market effect dominates the colonial effect, then the fertility effect of British colonization should be smaller when market access is high. And we basically test for this heterogeneous effect of British colonization using proximity to sea. And the results are provided by this graph. What we did is that we, to implement this heterogeneous analysis, we split our sample into areas far from and close to sea using the median value of the distribution of the distance to the coast. And we implement our main specification that I showed earlier for each of the subsample. And the results are provided or summarized by this graph. So on the here we can see that close to, it is only far from sea that the jump at the border is present and really and huge. So it's this graphical illustration is also confirmed by our RG regression. Clearly, what we see here, again, we split the sample into area close and far from sea for different bandwidth. And what we see here is that in area closer to the sea, there is no significant differences in fertility between Anglophone and Francophone. However, in areas, yes.
This is we are officially out of time. I sent you a note on the chat, but we need to wrap up. I wanted to give you a chance to move to that so we don't miss out on the Q&A.
Okay. So to basically wrap up, so our result, we also tried to analyze the mechanisms that drive the result, and we found only evidence for differences in the use of contraceptives. So this paper does show that women in former British colonies have fewer children, and this result is only present in areas with low market access. Yes. So and the mechanism is mainly driven by differences in colonial population policies. So thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I'm sorry to rush you at the end. And just as a note to the other presenters, I'll be sending you a chat for your time. So I hope you can see that if you don't know how to yet. We have 5 minutes for Q&A. And so Marie Christelle, can you see that part at the bottom, or is that just?
Yes.
Terrific.
So you mean Q&A, right?
Yes.
Okay, I see that, but there's nothing.
I don't see any questions there yet either. So everyone log in with your questions. Maybe I can get things started. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about how you're thinking about market access. You mentioned the opportunity cost of working, which I assume you're talking about the substitution effect, where the wages are higher, that women will have fewer children. But I'm also interested in the income effects too, how you're thinking about this.
So we find that the income effect is not actually the drivers of the results. So basically, market access here, the idea was to find something that create incentive for women to work. I mean, to have access to job and then to have this higher opportunity cost of childbearing. But this is so market access provides this exogeneity, and we just demonstrate that this market effect actually overcome the effect coming from other, let's say, other policies, such as the lack of the use of method of birth control. So our goal here was to provide some view that we can design some policies that mimic this exogenous effect of market access. in order to mitigate this difference or this effect of colonial population policies. Because, yeah.
We are going to have, I'm sorry, we've got to wrap up now because it's the next speaker's turn. So do you want to say anything in closing before we turn it over to Sun?
No, I think I'm done. Thank you.
Oh, terrific. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so Sun, your paper's up. We see your slides. And you can, I think if you put them in slide mode, it'll make them larger for everyone.
All right, can you see it?
Yep, that looks great. So Sun, I'll give you 15 minutes too, and I'll try to send you a note on the chat so that you know when you're getting close.
Okay.
Hi, Martha. Sorry, I just wanted to jump in. I don't think the note on the chat is going to work because if the presenter has it in the full screen mode, they can't see it. So you will have to jump in verbally.
Okay, I will. I'm sorry about that, Marie Christelle. I didn't realize that. I will jump in and tell you, Sun.
Okay, that's fine. Hello.
So take it away. It's all yours.
All right. Thank you so much for having me here. This paper is about identification of quantity-quality trade-off with imperfect fertility control. And this is a joint work with Juan Chuanlin at Peking University, Juan Pantano at the University of Arizona, and Rodrigo Pinto at UCLA. You guys can hear me, right?
Yes, we hear you great.
Okay, so the motivation here is that we know that quantity-quality trade-off, which means the effect of family size on child outcomes, is one of the most important issues in social scientists, among social scientists. So it's important because there's a long-standing theoretical prediction going all the way back to Beck that fewer children means more investment in each, which is the famous quantity-quality trade-off. And it's also key to understanding the consequences of a lot of policies. Some countries have, family planning policies, with prenatalist policies trying to increase family size. And there are also large implications for economic growth. And also it has been featured in many demographic transition models going all the way back also to the 1970s and 1960s. The problem here is that empirically descriptive evidence regarding how smaller families affects investment in children is not going to be enough because families are very different and they could be different in very unobservable ways. For example, if a family prefer their offspring, they spend more money on their offspring, invest in their children, they might also want to have more children. So when families have different preferences, they might spend more money on children as well as have more children, and resulting in a false it's basically a spurious correlation. So with that regard, economists have been using various kinds of exogenous variation in fertility, which means you need to find an instrument that affects family size without affecting any other unobservable ways. So the instrument that has been used so far includes a few things. The first thing is having twins, which is arguably an exogenous increase in family size. And the second thing is the so-called same-sex instrument. They use sibling sex composition, which observes that when families have the first two kids and they're of the same gender, they're more likely to have a third one just because they prefer variety. A third thing that has been used is the availability of contraceptive technology, meaning that if families have easy access to contraceptives, they might be able to control their family size and achieve a smaller one. And that easy access might vary in an exogenous way. But the problem here is the evidence so far has been very imprecise and inconclusive. And then also when people have evidence, the evidence is inconsistent across different interventions. When you use twins, you might be able to find the family size effects. But then when you use sibling sex composition, you might fail to find the family size effects. And it's kind of puzzling why this is happening. And this is what this paper is going to be about. So what we're going to do here is we're going to understand what's the role of imperfect fertility control in all of these. The idea here is that there are really, when you think about the exogenous increase in family size, there are really two different types of exogenous increase in family size. The first one is a planned increase in family size, meaning you want to have more. And the second one is an unplanned increase in family size, meaning you actually want to stop having children, but end up with more. So the idea is that those two are different types of treatment, and it's important to estimate them in different ways. Well, here's the challenge. First of all, there's very little data to tell you which children are planned and which children are unplanned. And the second part here is that, this kind of requires a more complicated theoretical framework. The third part is the identification challenge, which I will talk later. Okay, so given that we're talking about the treatment here, so first, just to expand on the treatment of increase in family size. So the common framework in the existing literature has been that there's no distinguish between intended and unintended birth. Basically you have an increase in family size, and people start to look at what's the effects of that increase in family size. Well, however, if you look at the data in the US, actually a lot of children are actually unintended. 30% of live births are resulted from unintended pregnancies. And you might think that unintended pregnancy mostly means that people are, having teenage pregnancy, they're having child too soon. But that's not actually true, because a large part of unintended pregnancy occurs not just early in a woman's childbearing years, but also late in their last birth. Actually, in the paper that the 3 of our 4 co-authors published earlier, we see that, among families that have the first 2 children, and those 2 are intended, and they went on to have a third, 20%, 25% of those third child actually were unintended, which means that this is actually an important factor when you think about increase of family size from the second to the third. All right, so here's what we're going to use in our data to observe this, which is actually, interestingly, in the 1985 PSID survey, they add a questionnaire for wives and for long-term female cohabitors. And what they do here is they ask a retrospective question about the pregnancy intention for each one of their children. So they ask them whether they want to have another baby at the time they had that particular baby. And with that, you can determine whether each one of their child is either intended or unintended. So we use this data and we construct a sample of the firstborn children who grew up in families with 2 or 3 children. So the idea here is whether having a third one will affect the education, all kinds of investment measurement for that firstborn children, for the firstborn children in those families. So here's the problem, which is we're going to need to understand what's the difference between the unintended and the intended birth. The idea here is that there are people who believe that there's only one kind of childbirth, and there doesn't seem to be any difference between unwanted or wanted childbirth. Well, here there is, because intended increase in family size means that the parents know with certainty and in advance how many children they're going to have. They're going to make a plan according to that, and they're going to invest in those children, and they're going to save money for their next child. While an unintended increase in family size means that you want to have 2 children and you want to stop, and then that third one will bring basically a disruption to the parental plan for the existing 2 children. It's also different between unintended and intended, because there are policies that are targeting actually those 2 different things. For example, if you have a family planning policy encouraging smaller families, and it's using something like a tax incentive, for example, and that's actually trying to change people's intention to have children. So it's kind of changing the intended family size. While on the other hand, if you have a family planning program that improves access to contraceptive technology, what you're doing here is to increase people's ability to avoid an unintended child. So in that way, actually, there are different types of policy targeting different types of increase in family size, if you think about it that way. Well, and with that, really, there are also matters when you choose your instruments, right? Because there are existing instruments that's actually targeting, trying to identify people who respond to this instrument by changing their intended family size. For example, the so-called same-sex instrument. When people have their 2 first children and they are boys, well, they want to have a third one, and the third one is going to be they hope it's going to be a girl, and that one is going to be their intention, right? But when you think about having something like abortion legalization, avoiding people having a third one, or when abortion is illegal and people have that third one, that's really affecting whether they're unintended. And there are actually evidence when we look at the data using the PSID that those two different instruments are actually affecting different things. So here's what we do. We run this so-called first stage, but we use two different instruments. The first instrument is whether the first two children in the family are the same sex. And the second instrument is whether after the second child was born, abortion become legal. And the idea here is that how those two things affect whether they have the third child. So if you look at the first...
About 5 minutes left, just as a warning.
Okay. So if you look at the first three columns, you're going to see that, so when you look at the first stage and the treatment is whether they have a third child, same-sex instrument is going to work, right? It's going to equal out when the first two are the same sex. Well, but if you look at column 4 to 9, this is where we actually divided, we divide that having third child treatment into having an intended third child and having an unintended third child. And you're going to see here that actually the same-sex instrument is only going to induce having an intended third child. It actually has nothing to do with whether the family have an unintended third or not. On the other hand, if you look at whether abortion is legal, it doesn't affect whether this family is going to have an intended third child at all, but it actually significantly decreases families' probability of having an unintended third child. So this is the first piece of evidence that actually those are two distinctive change in their distinctive types of treatment when you look at them with the data that's available. Okay, so here's the thing we look at next, which is we're going to use this to look at the second stage. How does this affect the outcomes, which is, for example, the children's completed years of education? I'm not going to go through all of this, but I'm going to give you an idea of what we're trying to do here, which is, well, the matter in that when you look at how a third child affects the first two children, even if you have two instruments, it's not going to be enough when you just use a traditional two-stage least square, right? So you use the same-sex instrument to IV for the intended third child, and you use the abortion instrument to IV for the third unintended child. And even if you find different effects, those are actually different effects from different compliers, right? You're going to find intended children effect for the compliers to the same-sex instrument, and you're going to find unintended children effects for the compliers of the abortion instrument. So even if you say they're different, it could very well be because they're coming from different groups in your sample. The compliers for same-sex instrument and the compliers for abortion instruments is definitely going to not be entirely the same. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to try to combine those two instruments, and we're going to try to find a way to identify the intended increase effect and the unintended increase effects for the same group. And we're going to use basically the same, the equivalent of a local average treatment effect, but with multiple instruments and multiple treatment types. And just to wrap up, because this is something that's still ongoing, what we're trying to do here is to have two instruments, the same-sex instrument and abortion legal instrument. And then we're going to have two different treatments, giving you three different treatment types. The first one is to have an intended third child. The second one is to have an unintended third child. And the third one is only to have two children. They're not going to have a third child. So with the four combination of instrument combination and the three treatment types, you're going to end up with 81 response types. Right? So you're going to have for each treatment types, for each instrument types, you're going to have three different possible response types. This is going to be a little overwhelming because you're going to have basically 81 types, and if you don't do anything about them, it's going to be impossible to identify. However, just like in the local average treatment effect framework, we can apply monotonicity and get rid of the defiers. In this one, we can also apply unordered monotonicity and get rid of actually a lot of the types. You're going to eliminate the same-sex defiers, those who have a third one that's intended when it's mixed sex. You're going to also eliminate the abortion defiers. And after all of that, you're going to end up with 7 types. And this is where we try to explore the identification strategy for this unordered treatment types. And here's what we're going to do. And again, this is not going to be the empirical results, but we're going to actually basically show you what we're trying to do, which is for among one of our co-authors, Rodrigo Pinto, actually recently published a paper about how you should identify the local average treatment effects when there are multiple treatment types and when there are multiple instruments. And basically what we can see here is for some types, we can actually identify their outcome, say years of education, when they have no extra child versus when they have a third extra child that is intended and that is unintended. And just to skip to what we're doing with the...
We need to wrap up.
Okay, I'm going to wrap up. Just to show you what we can achieve with the data and with this identification strategy. For example, if you look at row 4, this is where you can actually identify for type 4 the effects of having an unintended third child versus having no third child on the quality of your existing children. And we're going to achieve that by identifying the treatment types here. Basically, the treatment types here is important because you're going to see who are the compliers and who are the defiers and who are the always takers. And by doing that, we will be able to achieve identification of the family size effects on some certain types who are responding to the same-sex instrument and to the abortion instrument. Again, the key here is that we're going to be able to identify treatment effects of those two different types of treatment on the same subgroups. So they're going to be on the same kind of people, and you won't be able to say they're different because they're actually identifying of different compliers. I'm going to wrap up here, but feel free to ask me questions if you want to know details about this identification strategy. What we're doing here is we're going to distinguish between intended and unintended increase. I show you some results that there are different instruments going to affect those two different types of treatment very differently. And now we're going to exploit the novel empirical strategy to treat this treatment using multi-valued instruments. And that's how we're going to achieve identification under this imperfect fertility control. Again, this is very much ongoing process, so I welcome any kind of questions and also, comments on how we should do this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sun.
Yeah.
So attendees, please put your questions in the Q&A section.
Okay. Trying to see whether there are chat. I don't think there are any.
I'm not seeing any Q&As right now either.
Yeah.
There are 13 attendees here. Maybe they're getting tired. They're ready for the coffee break.
So I was going to ask the question myself, if that's okay, before we get any questions from the attendees. I was wondering if you could talk about what you expect the results will be.
So there are two different scenarios, right? So when you compare what's the difference between an unintended younger sibling and an intended younger sibling, there are two possible scenarios. The first one is that the dominant mechanism is dynamic complementarity. So basically the parents, they might invest in the existing children thinking that they will be able to follow through. So they invest a lot in the existing children, and actually following through in the later stage of existing children is actually more productive than shifting their resources to that extra one. So if that's the case, then having an unintended third one is not going to affect the first two that much, right? So they're going to follow through the investment in the first two. The different scenario, which will give you the opposite conclusion, which is, if parents are choosing a technology that's really only going to give you return in the long run if you can follow through, then they choose that technology for the first two kids, thinking that they're going to be able to follow through with enough resource. If they know they're not going to be able to follow through, they're going to choose a different technology that's going to yield some return in the short run. Then having that third one that's unintended is actually going to be extra bad news because parents are actually choosing some technology that's ex-post suboptimal. So they in that case they would regret that and wish they could choose something that's actually going to be a short-term productive. For example, think about sending your kids to a trade school, which you don't have to follow through for a very long time. It's going to have a short-term return. But if you're going to follow through, in the long run without having an extra third kid, then you might be able to invest in a professional degree, in a graduate degree. And in that sense, having this disruption is going to be extra bad news. So it really is an empirical question we're trying to answer.
Thank you so much, Shun.